This is the iPhone X, the latest and greatest from Apple. And this is the camera on the iPhone X. Now in recent years, the iPhone has become more than just a smartphone with a camera. It's no longer something that you just use to take selfies or take pictures of loved ones with. It's something that professionals actually use. Even Vogue magazine was using the iPhone for a number of its shoots. So in this video, I'm going to be doing an in-depth review of the camera on the iPhone. I'm going to be looking at the settings, the image quality, and just the general capability of this camera. I'm also going to be comparing it to the 7 Plus, which was last year's model, and also taking a few images with the Canon 80D as a benchmark. Now, I'm not really doing a direct comparison between the iPhone and the Canon 80D. Of course, the Canon 80D is better, but the Canon 80D images are just there to show you how the iPhone performs on a relative basis. So let's jump right in. We're going to start off by looking at some raw files from the iPhone. I'm going to open them up in Lightroom and we're going to see just how flexible these images are. Now, the stock camera app on the iPhone does not shoot RAW, so I had to use an app called ProCam. I'm not sponsored by ProCam, I'm not affiliated with them in any way, shape or form. This is just an app that I use and I prefer to use in certain scenarios if I want more information per image. So here you can see I've opened up a number of images in Lightroom and I've shot them in relatively harsh sunlight, and I've taken a bunch of different exposures. So I've taken some images which are very underexposed, some images which are quite heavily overexposed, like this one. And all I'm doing is I just want to test out the dynamic range and also how this performs in terms of flaring and so on. Now, based on some of the information I've been given, the iPhone X has better lenses on it and also a bigger sensor, which could prove quite useful in certain scenarios. So let's have a look at some of these images now. So first image here, and you can see the settings on top. iPhone X, or iPhone X I should say, it's a 4mm lens, which is an f1.8. I shot this at ISO 20 and at 1/2000th of a second. ISO 20 on the main camera is the base ISO. So we're going to have a look at how much noise creeps in when you start recovering the shadows. So I've already made a few changes to this, and if we increase the shadows quite a bit more, we can start to see how much noise creeps into the image, and it does become a very, very noisy image very quickly. Also, in bright sunlight, you can see a lot of flaring, and it doesn't handle flaring quite as well as I'd like it to, but it's a phone, that's just how it is. Great thing about raw files is the fact that you can change a lot of different features, like you can recover some of the highlights, and obviously I'm pushing this too far, but you can recover the highlights, the shadows, you can add contrast. I mean, you could do a lot of these things to a JPEG, but with a raw file, the files are just a little bit more flexible, so you can do a bit more. And also you can pick exactly what white balance you want the image to be after the fact. So if I put this into daylight, it's just a little bit warmer, and then cloudy as well, much warmer. And I think the cloudy white balance works a little bit better with this particular image. If we start looking at any images which are very heavily underexposed, then it becomes quite difficult to recover a lot of that lost data. So a lot of this data over here, yes, it's still visible to some extent, but it's not really usable in that sense. I mean, it becomes extremely noisy even at the base ISO of ISO 20. For highlights, I'd say you can recover about half a stop, maybe even a stop, if you overexpose slightly. So highlights, it's okay, it's not great, but it does mean that your shadows are going to be slightly cleaner. So you can see how over here, this is much cleaner than the other image was, and it's about the same in terms of exposure. With this camera, personally, if you are shooting RAW, I would shoot a little bit overexposed, just a tiny bit, and bring that back rather than underexposing it and bringing that back. Noise is a problem with the iPhone if you start pushing the shadows a bit more than you should. Now, as you know, the iPhone does have two cameras, so now we're looking at the tele lens, and with the tele lens you can actually push the ISO down a little bit further to ISO 16 or 15. I think ISO 16 is the base ISO. Obviously the aperture is different. This is a 2.4, this is f2.4, and this is a 6mm lens. Again, flaring is quite similar, but this one does get a bit of a ring around bright spots, and also you've still got that hot spot that comes in too. This is a very underexposed image, so if I start bringing that information back, you can actually bring out the shadows a little bit more, and the noise isn't that bad in comparison to the wider angle lens, which I'm a bit surprised about. Still not great, but it's actually a bit of an improvement, especially compared to the older iPhone, the iPhone 7 Plus. If you overexpose the telelens, you get a similar kind of result and similar recovery levels. You can recover about maybe 2/3 of a stop in the highlights, and you'll end up with a much cleaner image. So you can see how little noise there is in comparison to the other image. So as you can see from this, there's a distinct advantage when it comes to shooting in RAW. You've got far more flexibility in your images when it comes to the dynamic range, and you've also got the potential of being able to get better image quality just by adjusting the way that you shoot. You will need to edit your images, but you can use Lightroom CC on your mobile and edit them directly on your phone, which is quite straightforward. The other thing I want to talk about is time lapses. Now, as most of you are probably aware, the iPhone does allow you to shoot time lapses. The problem with the stock camera app is that it will crop the sensor, so you've got a smaller angle of view. And the other problem is the fact that it will only export your time lapses in 1080p. So even though the iPhone is a 4K capable camera, you aren't able to shoot 4K time lapses, which is a bit of a bummer really. I'm not too happy about that. Now, if you do want to shoot 4K time lapses, you can use ProCam, and the great thing about ProCam is that it won't crop the sensor any further, giving you a wider angle of view, which is very, very useful. And the fact that you can shoot 4K and export it in 4K at various frame rates like 24, 30, 48, and even 60 frames per second time lapses, which is amazing. The problem, however, with ProCam is that the footage you get from it is very, very quite jerky, because your shutter speed is going to be relatively fast if you're shooting outdoors because the aperture is quite wide, it's a fixed aperture. And the other thing is that you're not able to shoot as many frames within a certain period, within a certain interval, or have a shorter interval between each image. And the time lapse just ends up looking really jerky and just not that smooth and not very pleasing to look at. So at the moment, I don't think, personally for me, I don't think that the time-lapse options in the phone are great. It's not something that I'm pleased with in terms of the end result. The iPhone footage does look better. Sorry, the stock camera app on the iPhone looks better than ProCam, but it's not 4K. So it disadvantages both sides. Now, my favorite new feature in the iPhone X is the fact that both lenses have now got optical stabilization, which is very, very useful. Previously with the iPhone 8 Plus and even the iPhone 7 Plus, the telelens didn't have any optical stabilization, but the iPhone X does, which now means that you can shoot at a much slower shutter speed and still get sharp results. Now, the benefit of being able to shoot at slower shutter speeds is that if you're in lower light scenarios, you don't need to bump up the ISO as much, meaning that you're going to get cleaner, better detailed images. So as you can see from this example, I took a picture of this coffee and cookie, and even at 1/4 of a second, I was able to get really sharp results, which I'm very, very impressed about. With the iPhone 7 Plus, it was near enough impossible to get sharp results at 1/4 of a second, and I'm guessing that's probably the same with the iPhone 8 Plus too. So the optical stabilization in the telelens, definitely a welcome addition. I'm very, very pleased to see that. Okay, so let's get a little bit technical with these images now. I want to look at the colors from the iPhone, and I'm going to compare it to the Canon 80D. Again, we're not trying to determine which one is better. I just want to see how the iPhone holds up when it comes to the colors that it's producing. So I've taken a couple of pictures using the Canon 80D and the Sigma 1835, which is a fantastic lens, by the way. And I took a picture of something called a color checker passport. Did the same thing with the iPhone. They've both been shot in RAW, and I'm just going to show you what the differences are when it comes to the colors that both sensors are producing. Okay, so I've got both images opened up in Lightroom again. You've got the Canon 80D on the right and the iPhone on the left. And immediately from this distance, you can see that the 80D, the image, the colors are much more vibrant, much more richer in tone. And the iPhone is just a little bit flat, doesn't look as pleasing. And even when you zoom in, you can start to see the difference in terms of tones and color. Ignore the sharpness difference. This is just because I messed up on the focusing. The depth of field is obviously much shallower on this lens than it is on this one, so that's why. But when you're looking at the reds, the blues and everything, you can see there's a distinct difference between both cameras. But let's find out what happens when I apply the color checker passport profile onto the iPhone image, and then I just want to see what it looks like. So just go down here, Telly, and immediately, I don't know if you saw that, but the colors just became much more richer and much more vibrant just by changing the profile. So this is the embedded. You can see it's a little bit flat, and this is the actual profile. Now, I don't know how well you guys can see this on YouTube because it is going to be a compressed video, but I am going to export these images with the color profiles, and I'm going to let you look at them side by side so you can download the images if you want. But from what I can see, and I'm just going to have a look again, from what I can see, even from this distance, you can see how much more vibrant the iPhone image is now compared to what it was. And it's matching the Canon very, very well. I mean, there are certain colors that it's not matching as effectively. Like if you look at the greens, for example, like this green versus this green, this is still a little bit richer, and the blue's a little bit more vibrant on the Canon, but the difference is negligible. So I'm very impressed with how well the iPhone is able to produce those colors when you just apply a different profile. So iPhone's doing pretty well in terms of colors. So the great thing about this is the fact that you can get significantly better colors out of the iPhone if you're shooting RAW and using a color checker passport. Now, to be fair, a color checker passport isn't really that expensive, and I know that some of you might be asking the question, you know, who would actually want to do this, or how is this, you know, how is this going to be useful? No one's going to be sat around using a color checker passport when they're out and about. And that may be true, but the point of this is the fact that you can. So if you are using the iPhone in a more professional setting, if you are going to be taking some portraits, then and you want to get the most out of your colors, then a color checker passport is significantly going to improve the kind of colors you get for your images. The other thing that I tried with this iPhone is long exposures. Now, long exposures, unfortunately, as far as I can see, it's not really possible in camera. Now, the reason for this is because the slowest you can shoot with the shutter speed is 1/4 of a second, which is a bit of a bummer. Now, you can do something called mean stacking in the actual phone using ProCam. Now, ProCam has a feature called slow shutter, and when you use that, what it does is it stacks a bunch of images to create a long exposure look. It's not really long exposure, but it gives you that kind of look. So if you're shooting anything with moving water or clouds, then you can get that smoothing effect. The extra benefit of this is because you are mean stacking, you're going to get significantly cleaner images in camera. And as I mentioned, it does this in camera, which is fantastic. You don't need to take like 50 images, take it into Photoshop and then stack them together. ProCam does it for you, which I'm very pleased with. Now, because you can't really do long exposures, it doesn't have the same kind of look. It doesn't have that smooth look to it, but it's still a good enough feature. Nighttime, if you want to do long exposures and get light trails, and personally, in my opinion, or my thoughts of this is, it's not a great implementation because when you're shooting long exposures, you can't really do long exposures. What it's doing is it's just stacking a bunch of images, and the light trails effect doesn't look too great. I'm not too pleased with that result. And when I compare that to the 80D, you can see what light trails are supposed to look like at nighttime and what ProCam is doing to try and mimic that. Now on to what I think is quite possibly the most popular feature on the iPhone, and that's portrait mode. Now, I'm actually genuinely impressed with how the portraits are coming from this camera. I was out with my friends in Leeds, and I was out with my friend Chloe. You might have seen in one of my other videos, and I was just taking a bunch of portraits of her and some of the other people that we met. And honestly, I am very impressed with how well the iPhone is doing when it comes to taking portraits, especially in low light. So the kind of portraits that we were taking were at nighttime, and we were only using available light, and the kind of results that we're getting were actually quite good. And here were some of the images that we took. So first set of images here, and this is someone called Chin, who I met in Leeds. Really cool guy. So Chin, thank you for helping me with this. And this is the first picture that we took. This is just a little bit before sunset. Light was getting a little bit low, so I was using a street lamp to brighten up his face a little bit. And the results actually not bad. I mean, the detail that you get from the iPhone is actually pretty good. Now, the iPhone is heavily processing these images, so it's applying a lot of noise reduction and a lot of sharpening, but if you're using this on Facebook and Instagram, honestly, it's actually quite good considering where it's supposed to be posted. You can see this was shot at ISO 200, so the noise reduction is being applied quite heavily, but it's not detracting from the actual image, still producing a very good image. Problem with the iPhone is the fact that it does suffer when it comes to focusing. The focusing on the iPhone isn't great, especially when it comes to low light, and I really struggled when it came to the focusing and just getting the exposure right between the balance of having a brightly lit face and a dark background. But when you do nail focus eventually on this image over here, you can see that again it produces some very, very good quality images, albeit overly processed or heavily processed to some extent, but considering what it's for, I have to say I am still impressed with the quality of the image that you get from it. And even the background blur is actually pretty good. I'm not blown away by it, but I am impressed considering that this is from a phone. And even with this image, again, the way that it looks, the detail, the colors and everything, I really do like the quality that's coming from the portrait mode or the second lens on the iPhone X. Comparing the iPhone to the Canon 80D and the Sigma 1835, and I mean, obviously the Canon is going to produce more detailed and crisper images, so you can see from the hair and the colors in the hair. The iPhone is struggling when it comes to the detail in the hair and also the noise reduction that's been applied to the iPhone. These are both unprocessed. Obviously the iPhone has the internal processing, but aside from that, both of these images are completely unprocessed. And do you know what? I have to say the iPhone is doing really well compared to the 80D, even though the 80D is obviously still a much detailed and much better image. Looking at the actual bokeh and what kind of blur you get in the background, obviously the 80D is producing a much more pleasing look. And when it comes to background blur, iPhone isn't doing a great job in comparison, but consider the fact that this is shot on an iPhone and it's still looking really good. Even still, the Canon 80D is going to produce much better and more detailed images. So if you zoom into these images, you can start to see the kind of detail that you get from the 80D and the Sigma 1835 versus the iPhone and the heavily processed image when it comes to the noise reduction. But still, very impressive from the iPhone. When you start bumping up the ISO to about 400 and start shooting with the Canon 80D, you can get some really good results. But the iPhone isn't performing that bad in comparison. I'm just going to compare these two images that we took with this is the iPhone on the left and the Canon 80D on the right. And the iPhone is a little bit overexposed because I did struggle, and I continue to struggle with getting the exposure right when it comes to these darkened environments because the metering mode isn't brilliant in the iPhone. But still, looking at the two, the iPhone is performing quite well. When you zoom in, you start to see the extra detail from the Canon, and you're starting to pick up the noise that's and the noise reduction that's been applied to the iPhone. But depending on how you're using these images and where you're gonna post them, I don't think I'm going to be disappointed with the kind of results that the iPhone is producing. On to some of the things that I don't like about the iPhone X and the camera. And the first thing that I really don't like about this camera is actually one of the major things that I really don't like about it, and that's the autofocus. The autofocus on this camera it just sucks. It's really bad. And maybe I'm just comparing it to what my expectations of what autofocus should be, because I normally tend to use cameras that have dual pixel autofocus or cameras with significantly better autofocus systems. So my perspective on this might be a little bit warped in that sense, and I might be expecting too much out of it, but still, the autofocus on this is much worse than anything I've used, including the Samsung cameras, because the Samsung S7 and the S8, I believe they have dual pixel autofocus, and their dual pixel autofocus is significantly better, and in my experience it's been just so good. It just tracks the subject really well and it just locks on, and that's something that I'm used to with my DSLRs. The iPhone, however, doesn't have that feature, so autofocus it's always hunting, and you can't lock the autofocus onto anything so that it tracks that subject. Just one of those things I'm not too keen on, I'm not too happy about. The other thing that I really don't like about the iPhone is the fact that you can't lock the exposure. So once you've kind of got the exposure that you want in the stock camera app, of course, you can't lock the exposure, which is a massive pain, because it's trying to meter for the whole scene as opposed to a select area. I don't think you could change the metering modes either. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it's using evaluative metering. And what that does is it looks at the whole scene and tries to meter for it to get like a mid exposure for the whole scene. So if you've got any dark points or bright points, it'll try and go for a mid point as opposed to exposing for any of those specifics. So whilst I was shooting in Leeds, I was shooting at night time. So I wanted a darker, moodier toned image. I wanted the skin tones to be well exposed and the rest of the background to be relatively darker. So I had to keep changing the exposure, and when I changed the exposure, the autofocus would go somewhere else and it'd start focusing elsewhere, and it was just a bad experience in terms of trying to expose and use the camera in that sense. So low light autofocus, not that great during the day. Low light exposure, low light autofocus is horrible. During the day, it's okay. And the fact that you can't lock the exposure is another thing which I'm not too keen on, and I'm really disappointed about. It's not really difficult to do. I mean, you should just be able to tap it and where the exposure is. That's what the exposure is, unless you want to move it. The last thing I want to talk about is animojis. Now, I know a lot of people scoffed at this, and they were talking about how this is a nonsense feature and Apple spent so much time presenting this and they should have presented all the other features that they put in. But you know what? After using this, I'm kind of on the side of animojis. I really am. I'll explain why. First thing, the technology is actually pretty good. When you use it, the face tracking and the way that it maps, or the way that it's able to see your face and see how the muscles interact, is actually very good. I'm quite impressed with how well it works. And the second thing is, my 1-year-old daughter loves this. She laughs so much when I use animojis, and because of that one thing, it's a win in my book. She can sit on my lap and she laughs so much at this feature. So that's me. For me, that's a win. And the thing that I'm realizing is, I know I scoffed at it. I thought it was nonsense when it came out, and I was complaining about animojis as well, and the fact that Apple should have talked about the other features that they put in, because they did put in a bunch of new features in this new camera, but they stuck with animojis. But the thing that I'm starting to understand is the fact that Apple seems to be the only company that knows how to have fun. They're putting these features in which are actually a lot of fun, and a lot of the other companies like Google and Samsung and all of them just take their technology way too seriously. Google's jumping up about how DxO Mark scores and how great their camera is and so on and that. And yeah, okay, fine, great, but Apple just know how to have a little bit of fun, and that's what I'm enjoying at the moment. And my daughter loves it, so automatically I love it. Anyway, just want to say thank you so much for watching my video. I really do appreciate you guys taking the time. I know this was a bit of a long one, but I wanted to cram in a bunch of information and a bunch of comparisons, because I really wanted to do a proper in-depth review for this camera. If you have any comments, suggestions, please leave them below. I will try and get back to you as soon as possible. Hit the like button, please subscribe, share this video. I'd really appreciate if you could share this video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Thank you. Nom 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 nom.